Energy is an important topic ranging from energy justice to energy reliability. This panel will explore the need to improve energy justice and how it improves the quality of life. Grid resiliency through energy storage will be important to offset power interruptions due to climate events. The group that we have up here are experts, and first I'm going to introduce Carlos Carranza, who will moderate. Carlos is the Director of Environmental Infrastructure Finance here at the bank. He has more than 16 years of experience in the areas of structured finance and project finance. He serves as the director, again, for infrastructure financing and is structured financing for landmark renewable energy projects both in the U.S. and Mexico, and has extensive experience in structuring financing for state and municipal projects. Please give this panel a warm welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesse. Good afternoon. Why don't we bring the drinks here and we can start? So, no, thank you very much. I'm very glad to be part of this panel. And we have a very interesting participants that I want to introduce. First, we have Daniel Cohen. Dr. Daniel Cohen is an associate professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Rice University. His research specializes in development of photochemical models and their application to air quality management, or certain analysis, energy policy, and health impact studies. Before joining Rice, Dr. Cohen worked for the Air Protection Branch of the Georgia Environmental Protection Division. He received a BA in Applied Mathematics for Harvard University, a PhD in Atmospheric Chemistry from Georgia Tech, and served as Fulbright Scholar to Australia at the Cooperative Research Center for Southern Hemisphere Meteorology. Dr. Cohen is a recipient of National Science Foundation Career, Young Investigator Award, and past member of the NASA Air Quality Applied Science team. We also have here with us Hector Garza. Hector consults on the environmental aspects for project development and financing, including application with the federal, state, and municipal authorities, environmental impact assessment, due diligence, social impact assessments, human rights impact assessments, free, prior, and informed consent, Equator Principle and IBC standards, ESG, life science, climate change, pollution and remediation, circular economies, and ejido law. He provides advice in negotiation with indigenous communities towards the development of energy, infrastructure, mining, and tourism projects, including the design and implementation of cultural pertinent shared benefit mechanism. His practice includes administrative and constitutional litigation with emphasis in human rights, indigenous people law, FPIC, and environmental law. We also have here with us today Jose Maria Lujambio. He's a partner at Cashaw, Cavazos, and Newton, where he heads the Mexico energy practice. Since joining the firm in 2014, his work for clients has included Mexico regulatory and permitting support, as well as negotiation of several kinds of energy services and procurement contracts for utility scale and on-site power plants deploying wind, solar, and cogeneration technology in Mexico. He has represented natural gas and all midstream and downstream companies in Mexico, as well as numerous end users, particularly from the manufacturing industry in Mexico. Previously, he worked for many years in the Mexico public sector. From 2009 to 2012, he was the general counsel for the Mexican Energy Regulatory Commission, where he led the regulatory implementation of the 2018 energy reform in the renewable energy and gas sectors. From 2005 to 2009, he worked as an attorney at the Legal Counsel Office of Mexico's president, focusing in legislation and presidential rules, as well as federal consultation affairs. He also served as advisor to the Mexican Social Security Institute, the Department of Interior, and the president of the Chamber of Deputies. In the academic field, in 2014, Lujambio obtained a Master's of Law degree with energy concentration for the University of Texas at Austin. In 2013, he coordinated the energy research and networking agenda for the Center of Research for Development. Previously, in 2003, Lujambio obtained a Master of Fundamental Rights degree from University of Carlos III, Madrid, Spain. In 2002, he received his law degree from Autonomous Technological Institute in Mexico, ITAM. Lujambio has been a featured speaker, panelist, and moderator at dozens of business and academic conferences. He has published several essays and articles on energy regulation and constitutional law topics. He currently serves as secretary of the board of the Mexican Solar Photovoltaic Association, ASOLMEX, and co-chair of Primeros IPC Oil, Gas, and Energy Practice Group. Rujambio is also a member of the Mexican Lawyers Bar and Gulf Coast Power Association. Also here in the panel, we have Dr. Chris Roberts. It's a principal with KPMG Infrastructure and Project Advisors Practice and leads the infrastructure strategy and asset management work in the U.S. Chris has worked 28 years of global experience providing advisory services, developing long-term plans and capabilities to respond to today's challenges of aging infrastructure, climate resiliency, and sustainable while driving performance through digitalization, energy transition, and ESG opportunities. A fellow of the Institute of Asset Management, and registered asset management professional. Chris was a national nominated principal expert and contributing author to the International Standard Organization for the Standard for Asset Management. Chris is also the current president of the Institute of Asset Management and board of director for both the Institute of Asset Management and the Global Forum on Maintenance and Asset Management. He's also an advisor to the United Nations Infrastructure Asset Management Reference Council. Thank you very much for being part of this panel, everybody. And we will be talking about energy justice and global trends and local trends on energy. And first of all, I want to start with a question for everybody. And I would like to know what's your opinion on the energy justice and what are the main challenges in the US and Mexico to apply this concept? I don't know, Chris, if you want to start.
Certainly, yeah, just checking it worked. Yeah, good question. I think I won't sort of cover everything because I'm sure I need to give a little bit of speaking time for my colleagues here. But in my mind, when I think about energy justice, I look at physical assets. That's what I do. I look at infrastructure very broadly, and I see today, physical assets, they sustain human life. There's no question about that. And arguably, energy, the energy assets themselves, are the backbone of everything else that we do. So whether it's roads, transportation, and everything else, and we're certainly seeing through the adoption of EV and other such disruptions in the marketplace, an increasing reliance on energy. Through the digital economy, we rely on energy. We can't buy things in shops without access to electricity to power those little devices which we swipe our cards in. So for me, when we start to talk about energy equity or energy justice, it's not just about providing power to disadvantaged communities, but it's also recognizing that those communities are relying on other infrastructure assets. And it's making sure that we truly are thinking about that sort of extended asset value chain that exists, and thinking it through in a very different way than we've thought about before, really focusing in on what are our value drivers for our assets, not just for energy, but for all of the other asset segments that I've just loosely referred to, and thinking through about how we truly do provide those services to all communities, and really focusing on those disadvantaged communities. So maybe just leaving it there as an opener for the others to contribute.
Thank you very much, Chris. Jose Maria, do you want to continue?
Sure. Perhaps due to my legal perspective, I would have two different concepts of energy justice. One that would have to do with the general application of the rule of law in the energy sector, I would say. In that sense, I think that in Mexico we have two challenges. One is cultural and has to do with a more loose and even cynical approach to the role of law in organizing society that we have in Latin America compared to the United States. That's a fact. It's cultural. And also from the more political standpoint, it has to do, I think, with the willingness or the commitment of each administration in Mexico to issue policy and regulation based on the paths established in the previously enacted laws. No? And of course, there are governments more prone to that than others. And perhaps a more like a more precise or more specific definition or concept of energy justice would have to do with what Chris was saying, in the sense that it's a matter of access, and particularly equality of access to energy, but defining it in terms of reliability, in terms of cleanliness, and in terms of affordability. So I think that if those aspects are fulfilled, we are talking about a complete concept of energy justice. In Mexico, the challenge, of course, has to do with our levels of poverty. Half of the population lives under on poverty standards. No? So I think the discussion needs to take place also in terms of general equality of opportunities for the population.
Thank you very much. Daniel.
Yeah, so I guess wearing two hats, as an atmospheric scientist by training, but as someone who studies energy systems, I look at the justice concern in two ways. One is environmental justice, is that most of the environmental justice problems, most of the air pollution hazards and other pollution hazards that we faced have come from the production and use of energy. That's the dominant source of air pollutants and greenhouse gases. And so there's a real opportunity as we shift from some of the fossil fuel industries that have been the main sources of air pollution in our cities, and especially in disadvantaged communities. There's an opportunity that some of the biggest benefits of the energy transition environmentally can go to the communities that have been most disadvantaged. But looking at energy systems, looking at the energy transition, I also see that many of the opportunities arise are going to be most easily grasped by those with the means to afford it. You may have seen the headlines today that California just decided to outlaw gasoline car sales by 2035. There's huge tax credits now for electric cars, but who will have the opportunity to buy the new cars? Will there be the charging infrastructure? There's enormous amounts of credits now for making homes more efficient, for switching over to heat pumps, for adding solar panels to roofs. Now you can get a full tax credit for battery storage systems. Again, those are going to be most available to homeowners, to people with the means to put forward those investments. And so I think tremendous opportunities that will come from this clean energy transition that's underway in the United States and other parts of the world, but need to have in mind of how can those benefits be spread in equitable and just ways.
Thank you very much. Hector, your opinion?
Yes, thank you. When being trained as a lawyer, when I hear the word justice, I always naturally go back to the definition of justice of Justiniano, no? And that means to render everyone his due. Then I jump back to John Rawls, the theory of justice, and the veil of ignorance. And then I go back to not my training as a lawyer, but as a lawyer that actually deals on a daily basis with indigenous peoples. And then this concept becomes very elastic. What does an indigenous community want? What is justice to them? What energy they want? And when we go through a process of engaging an indigenous community as part of a project, a development of any kind of project, including obviously and naturally renewable energy projects, the hardest part is actually building this intercultural dialogue and understanding their cosmogony. What do they need? What do they want? And then we do a study that we call the circles of vulnerability. Why is this community vulnerable? And every single time we go down to two basic elements. One, their inadequate access to potable water, and second, to very expensive energy. So yeah, absolutely. When we're talking about equitable access to energy, we're talking about human rights, but within a specific worldview. And I think that that is particularly challenging in Mexico because of the nature of how we have defined access to human rights. Whenever going down this path, we must consider that the most recent numbers in Mexico that were produced by INPI last year says that 20 to 25% of the Mexican population think of themselves as indigenous. And that's over 30% of the Mexican territory is held within by indigenous communities, and we don't have First Nation treaties. So that's complex. Just in Mexico City, for all that have been there, just in Mexico City, it's 128 indigenous communities and comparable communities, just in Mexico City. So that's a tough one.
Thank you very much, Hector. One of the main concepts of energy justice is to provide energy with renewable energy sources. Daniel, in your book, Confronting Climate Gridlock, you describe all the different renewable energy sources, but the two most common and most cheap are solar and wind. But we know that those are variable sources that can affect the stability of the grid. So which one can complement these two, or if there's any other technology that can get rid of these two and be more effective? I know that you talk about the concentrated solar, geothermal, but not are really proved. So what's your opinion on this?
Right. So thank you. Great question, and appreciate the bank making the book available for those who got here early enough. If we want to decarbonize the grids quickly, and President Biden has set a target of 2035 for 100% clean electricity. I think there are now at least about 10 states that have set 100% clean electricity pledges, often by 2040 to 2050. The only way we can do that quickly is with wind and solar. Keeping existing nuclear plants, existing hydropower is important, but in terms of what is the most affordable option to ramp up quickly to be have huge amounts come online by the early 2030s, wind and solar are winning the day. But as you said, it's not sunny all the time. It's not windy all the time. We've done research at Rice that has shown that if you pair solar really anywhere with wind from many different parts of the state, many different parts of the country, you can get a long way there by the way they complement each other. That it's on the order of just maybe 10% of the time when it's neither windy nor sunny, if you can spread your wind resources in a lot of places, but that still means more needs to be done. And so it's going to come from transmission infrastructure to be able to blend more sources. We were just talking about some of the challenges of building those high voltage lines. It's going to mean having more distributed resources, so making it possible to build more resources closer to where it's needed, even if it's not the sunniest or windiest, but if you're getting closer to load, if you can make that load more flexible. Storage is coming on very fast. It's grown by more than a factor of 20 in the past couple of years in Texas, with another factor of 10 growth likely on the way. And then we'll need something firm and flexible. And so I think historically it's been natural gas that's provided the flex. There are ways that you can have carbon capture on natural gas. Historically, nuclear has played a big role, but the projects that have been tried in the US and Europe recently have run several times over budget. So it's risky to count on that being able to be built soon. The wild card that I see, that I saw a lot of potential in interviewing people and seeing some companies go. So Fervo just announced over 100 million in new funding yesterday. It was in the news. Is really if geothermal was able to get to the point where some of these test wells being drilled now, we're able to go get what they think they can achieve from deep drilling, taking a lot of the oil and gas expertise that's coming out of Texas, that's coming out of this region. If that can be deployed to be able to get more geothermal extracted from deeper resources, I think that has the potential. It's, again, not certain, but has a potential to be a game changer in large parts of North America.
Thank you very much. Chris, you have a global perspective, with your experience globally, could you please give us a sense on what are the trends for energy and renewable energy in the world?
Yeah, and I will, and I'll just add to what Daniel's just said there as well. So, when you look across the globe, and I'm conscious of time, and everybody's sort of looking forward to running off to a drink, so I'll summarize it pretty quick. But we're seeing right now mega disruption in the energy market. I think we would all agree to that. We're seeing on the back of the Ukraine situation, obviously that's a big driving part of that disruption. But again, the climate resilience and climate sustainability is also on the tail of that and is really pushing some of this disruption through. Cost of energy is spiraling out of control in some parts of the world. We've seen Australia, UK, Europe putting in place price caps. We've seen parts of Europe and South Africa putting in place scheduled outages. And in the UK, actually warning that there could be a winter of scheduled outages to make sure that we're able to manage the consumer demand against the generation ability. So some real challenges there that are happening across the global landscape. Daniel talked about a couple of the major renewable sources, solar, PV, and wind being the sort of two that we generally focus on. And of course, they're great because they're scalable. We can introduce them very quickly. We can ramp up. We can put solar on top of houses, for example, and we can put wind just in about any corner of a field. But the challenge that you've got with those two aspects or two alternatives is you still need to think about the grid. You still need to think about the network. You need to think about storage. So it's not just about creating generational capability, but it's also thinking about the network capability to move that electricity around. And as Daniel said, if it's raining in one part of the state and it's sunny in another part of the state, you sort of get that balancing effect. That's great if you've got the grid to accommodate that. So there is a real need to invest in the grid. The reason why I just touched on those global issues at the beginning, the sort of cap on prices, those scheduled outages or the threat of scheduled outages, is we're now in that sort of point in this energy transition where we have to start educating communities. And this is all communities. We have to start educating communities on just what the dependence on energy means and the repercussions of being so dependent and so greedy with the use of energy and how that then impacts other communities, including disadvantaged communities. So, when my kids leave the lights on, yeah, I'm a little annoyed, but they need to start learning that it's not just impacting me and my pocketbook in terms of what I'm paying for my energy costs, but it's actually impacting the community's ability to continue to power things like schools, like hospitals, like consumer and retail. So when they go to the local Starbucks for that coffee and they're like, "That it wasn't working," I'm like, "That's because you used all the electricity leaving the lights on."
Yeah, and based on what you're saying is very interesting. I think that what you're saying is we have seen a lot of like publicity and everything about the water scarcity, and people is more aware of that because it's tangible. But I haven't seen any of energy. So have you seen in other?
I saw this great thing many years ago. It was about maybe a decade ago, which was an advert in Australia, because Australia's had electricity challenges for many years, and it was an advert that just showed the socket in the wall and these sort of black clouds coming out of the socket, which was the energy just being lost in a home, and it really sort of drew my attention. I remember speaking to an Australian colleague who he managed to get his kids to turn the lights off more than I did. So there was clearly something going on there. I do think, on a global scale, we're going to see over the next 5 years, I think, a lot more government campaigns, policies being introduced to really try and reduce that energy consumption in the household. I mean, we've got options in some states right now to sign up to that. I sign up to a system in my local county where When the energy demand is high, it cuts out the air conditioning in the house for 5 minutes, an hour, whatever it is. I don't know what it is, but I don't feel the impact. I don't feel the impact generally, but it's reducing my load on the network, and that is an opt-in right now, and I think it needs to be something more than an opt-in as far as government setting policy.
One trend I'll be looking at in terms of that supply or scarcity is that we had been for many decades in a pattern where electricity demand was doubling every decade, and it was going up and up and up, and then it really has been flat for over 2 decades now, where efficiency has improved fast enough to balance the growth in population and economy. Now I think we're probably at an inflection point where it's going to start growing incredibly rapidly again as we electrify our fleet, as natural gas prices are now 4 times what they had been in the US and 10 times maybe, lose track by the day in Europe. There's going to be a move to electrify more heating, to electrify more industries. And so with all of that, I think we're about to hit a new inflection. We're going to need to be ramping up our supply of electricity at the same time as we're probably going to be closing most of the coal power plants. And so there will be that need to start thinking in ways that we haven't had to in this very slow growth or stagnant time that we've been in.
Sorry, you made a good point. I lost energy. You make a good point there. You talk about that 2 decades of stagnant growth, and yet when we came out of the pandemic, 21, there was a massive surge in energy consumption across the globe, partly driven by China and India and elsewhere, but still a surge nonetheless. And what we're seeing today, as particularly on the back of what I was saying before with the Ukraine situation and everything else, the interest in EVs has peaked. It's climbing rapidly. I don't think it is the $7,500 tax credit that's driving that. I think it's the fact that it's $6 a gallon at the pump that's driving that, and people are now starting to wake up to that. But you start to think about plugging all of those cars into the network, and the network's not going to handle it. We know that already.
Thank you very much. Going back to energy justice, Jose Maria, is there any legal framework in the U.S. or any other country that that has these energy justice principles? And in the case of Mexico, as far as I know, is there an initiative that will create the path for this energy justice or no?
Well, many of you know that on October of last year, President López Obrador presented an initiative, a bill to amend Mexico's constitution. The main goal was to roll back the market reforms and come back to the monopolistic model of CFE handling the whole value chain of the electricity sector. But one of the aspects that was kind of not very well discussed or analyzed was a line that he was proposing to include in Article 27 of the Constitution that mentioned the principle of continuity of energy supply as means to guarantee a dignified life. So those words were proposed by President López Obrador to be included in Mexico's constitution. There's something valuable in that, in the sense that, so at least it sets forth a much needed conversation about access to energy. I don't know if the initiative's phrasing was the most like pure or orthodox in the way it was framed, but during the debates in the Chamber of Deputies, this aspect was really ignored. Everyone was just talking about the general framework of the electricity industry, but all this talk about access to electricity and this continuity of electric supply and this concept of dignified life, which is present in some international treaties of human rights down there, but without much elaboration. So again, it's a debate that needs to be, that we need to have in Mexico. And the initiative had that particularly valuable aspect, I would say.
And during the appeal process that took place like a few months ago, there was a debate and some arguments about type of energy justice. Is this something that make the decision for the Supreme Court, like the path that they took? Do you think that that was one of the things that they for making this decision, or no?
No, so you're talking about the amendments to the electricity industry law, which were challenged by the Senate or by certain senators, and the Supreme Court took a decision about that. One of the Supreme Court's justices, Loretta Ortiz, was framing her argument around the idea that there was kind of an implicit right, human right to access to electricity based on certain language of the current constitution and international treaties. And she was using that considerations to defend that the electricity industry law was constitutional because it was aimed to protect or to guarantee that access to electricity. At the end of the day, this position was not the majority in the Supreme Court. I think Judge Ortiz was a little confused because this is not something that is currently included in Mexico's constitution. It was proposed by the president, but it's not there right now. And at the end of the day, it was not useful for the final decision or decisions, really, that the Supreme Court made in the different aspects of the electricity industry law.
Thank you very much. Hector, in your most recent paper, you emphasize human rights. Could you please explain with this topic is unique in the case of Mexico as compared to United States and Canada? Why is so special in Mexico?
Correct. Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay. Actually, this actually builds on Jose Maria's comment. The difference, or one of the beauties about Mexico, I don't know if it's beautiful or it's quite the opposite, but it's very complex. Our Constitution, it's not the actual text of the Constitution only. We have this concept that we call constitutional bloc. Basically, and I'm oversimplifying this, but basically, because of a resolution issued by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights back in 2009, Mexico was forced to revise the Constitution, Article 1st, and after that reform, now, today, our Constitution is the text of the Constitution plus every human rights treaty that has been entered into and ratified by Mexico, plus every single jurisprudence issued by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. And that creates one single unified block, and that is the Mexican Constitution. So any citizen in Mexico can actually invoke directly any human rights treaty at a lawsuit, and the judge must apply the human rights treaty or the jurisprudence of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights directly. And that is the reason why the amendment to the Constitution that was attempted was hard. It was hard to go through an argument where you can amend laws that could potentially harm a human right to a healthy environment. That is a human right. That is protected by the Mexican Constitution. Access to, for example, in the case of indigenous peoples, FPIC, free, prior, and informed consultation. That is the Mexican Constitution under ILA Convention 169. Escazú Agreement, access to environmental information and participation for every Mexican citizen. That is the Mexican Constitution. And therefore, the argument becomes very, very complex. So the reasoning behind why, even despite the fact that in that particular vote through the Senate, when the reforms were challenged, it did not pass. But today, as we speak, a bunch of lawsuits that were filed by companies or indigenous communities or even citizens are actually being won by these companies and indigenous peoples. And in the end, what will happen is that these amendments to the federal law will be overturned because of human rights.
Thank you very much, Hector. One thing of energy justice is to bring energy to low-income communities, disadvantaged communities, but there's no infrastructure. So I think it's a huge problem then. Daniel, in the US, we know that there are some concepts of municipal utilities, community solar. Do you think that this could be a solution, or even though that we know that they're poor, probably they don't have the money to pay this infrastructure? Do you think this could be a solution for that?
It can be a partial solution. It can be, there are places where by having locally sourced electricity, microgrids, community solar, community purchases, that it can get around some of the problems that we have, as was pointed out, that it is so hard to build the long distance lines and can overcome some of the distribution and transmission hurdles. But there are reasons why engineers have said that the electric grid was perhaps one of the most beneficial advances of the last century, is that by being able to spread resources, by being able to have some centralized production and to move power around, it has made so much growth possible. So I think as we look for community solutions and the role of those distributed resources, we need to also be expanding the broader resources that probably have the most potential to bring the most amounts of energy to the largest numbers of people at the lowest prices.
Thank you very much. Chris, and what have you seen in North America? What are the trends? How the energy is working here? What are the projects? What is coming?
What is coming? It's a very big question. Daniel's probably more qualified to answer that than I am, really. But you know, I certainly, what you asked about trends a little earlier, the organization that I volunteer for, the Institute of Asset Management, we recently published a mega trends document that sets out sort of 10 key trends that we were seeing across the globe, and I think they are equally valid here in the United States as they are in other corners of the world. And in fact, a number of the examples that we gave in just sort of describing those trends were based on US issues. I mean, I think one of the things which, you know, we need to think about is, as we start to introduce new electricity, new energy generation capability, new energy transmission and distribution capabilities, in particular as we start to try and optimize and drive efficiency within how we're using that electricity and spreading it around, using the likes of storage systems, etc. We're going to be relying on a lot of technology. There's no doubt about that. At the same time as the energy transition. I don't want to just focus in on this as one trend, but I do think it's an important trend that we acknowledge, that cyber security is on the increase. The FBI reported during the pandemic a 69% increase in cyber attacks. We've seen that on across the US. I won't name and shame different corners of the US, but we've seen it across the US, not just in energy utilities, but power utilities and everywhere else. We're going to start seeing more physical security issues. We see vandalism as a major issue. That's always been the case, but that's going to increase as well. So, you know, in my mind, as we start to think about scaling as part of the energy transition, scaling generational capability, thinking about microgrids, thinking about more localized solar or wind farms or what have you, we've got to start making sure that we're fully thinking about the sort of digital transformation and the disruption that will have if we don't get the security aspects of that right. So that's one of the things which I think is out there. The panel before talked about the Inflation Reduction Act. There's $57 billion of accelerator grants there for clean energy, and a ton more dollars available for driving the energy transition. Of course, we've got IJA, the Investments in Infrastructure and Jobs Act, or bill, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. We did a conference earlier in the year, and I said, Bill is like your favorite uncle. He's loaded and he's very green and he's a bit hippie. So, and I think that's very true with the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. There is a lot of funding available for green energy and really driving the environmental value related to infrastructure. So these are obviously some of the trends. The challenge that we've got today, right now, is resource. The ability, the human capacity, as well as the financial capacity to really drive these things through. The grid in the US has a major infrastructure deficit. The assets are aging out. If we wanted to fully transform the grid to a renewable base, I think it was the American Society of Civil Engineers suggested it was a $4.5 trillion investment. That's 4 times the size of IJA in its entirety. So we've got some major challenges with financing that, but we've also got the challenge of just the human capital to go out and build it, and build those products that we're deploying. So that's, again, not just the US. Everybody's experiencing that across the globe, but it's certainly playing out in the United States for sure.
So you mentioned one thing now that's very important. The Inflation Reduction Act there's a lot of money. There's a willingness to move these projects. So what is next? What we are going to expect now to move projects and to start getting money for that? So how can we start this?
I think when I hear Chris talk about mega trends, I think this Inflation Reduction Act is going to just push all these mega trends, I guess on steroids isn't the right way to say speed, but whatever, to supercharge or super accelerate these trends. And it remains to be seen, are we going to do it in a smart way, or are we going to do it in a dumb way? There are huge tax credits basically for any new wind or solar or any other clean project that you build, whether it's where it's at the right timing or where it's needed or not. Those are going to be growing incredibly fast. There's money for electrification. We're going to be moving towards electric cars and electric heating. And if that's done in the dumb way, like I have my electric car, where I just plug it into a dumb charger, it's going to have all of us charging at 5 o'clock at night as the sun is setting. And so we're going to have this collision of this very rapid growth of solar with this very rapid growth of electric cars. The technology is there to make smart chargers, to make smart water heaters, to make these trends where electrification can be done in a way that makes it easier to incorporate more clean energy into the grid. But the third trend that I see happening at the same time is that as these other 2 pillars are growing so quickly, it is as hard as ever to build new infrastructure. And so whereas we would need infrastructure to merge all this together, and we did pass an infrastructure bill, but it had maybe 1/10 as much as is needed for much of the energy infrastructure going forward. So I think there's going to be a need to make it easier to build the energy infrastructure to handle these other 2 big trends of this huge clean electricity surge and this huge trend towards electrification, and to be sure they're done in a manageable way.
Just another point, actually. When we looked at the 2008 recession and we invested in infrastructure, and that was a global trend, the projects which we spent money on were what we referred to as shovel-ready projects. I think that the term was sort of coined around then, which meant that we put people to work, which is what we needed to do, and we fixed some of the immediate state of good repair type issues on infrastructure. But that quickly dried up, and it dried up because we didn't have planning-ready projects. And as you've just touched on, planning and the permitting and everything else is such a long cycle that's what starts to delay things. So what we're seeing today, right now, with IJA is still we're focused on shovel-ready projects. We still don't have a backlog in terms of the planning ready projects to really move the whole energy transition piece forward. And then with IJA and that Justice 40 requirement that the previous panel referred to, really focusing on social equity. We're not really looking at shovel ready, or rather, we shouldn't be looking at shovel ready. We should be looking at shovel worthy projects and really making sure that we're investing in the right place to achieve those intended outcomes. So today, right now, I don't believe that we're approaching this the right way. I think what we've seen so far, there's 6 months in, there's $110 billion of competitive grant funding that's sort of, formula grant funding that's being kicked out. Roughly equates to about $25 million a project. So it's small stuff, generally speaking, that's being kicked out, and it's the shovel-ready stuff. And we're really not quite there yet, thinking about planning ready and that shovel-worthy of just where we should be investing in infrastructure for the greater good of the United States.
Thank you very much. Now, in Mexico, the trend now, we know that the federal government is trying to strengthen CFE instead of promoting private participation. Jose Maria and Hector, do you think that with this policy is more feasible that they can achieve energy justice, or you think that this is going to delay this energy justice?
Well, again, yes. Again, I think it all depends on the concept of energy justice that we could be using. But what is clear is that most of the policy and regulatory measures taken by this administration in Mexico have failed in court because they attempt against Mexico's constitution, and particularly to two main contents of our constitution, which is the free competition principle, which applies to electricity generation and sales, plus, as Hector was mentioning, the right to a healthy environment, which is a human right expressly contained in Mexico's constitution. So courts, federal courts, the judiciary has granted injunctions to most of the companies that are CFE's competitors. And here we are talking about generation companies, of course, the big ones, the Iberdrolas, the Engis, and the Enels of the world, but also dozens of others, developers like medium and small size developers of generation that really were not part of this power mafia, right? And they are also affected. And again, as Hector was saying, not only companies filed lawsuits, but also environmental organizations. And the role of this environmental litigation, which is kind of this strategic litigation to try to find I would say, avant-garde rulings from courts regarding climate change and regarding environmental protection is something new in Mexico and relatively new. And we need to keep moving in that path, taking, I guess, lessons from things that are happening here in the United States and elsewhere.
Thank you. Hector?
Yeah, building on top of that, I fully agree with Jose Maria. I think that when all of this trend of going against the energy reform at a federal level happened, my concern naturally was with people. You know, how will this decision, this political decision, drip down all the way to the pockets of vulnerable communities? And then my natural instinct was this is gonna blow up in our faces very, very quickly, because, and I agree with Jose Maria, you have the Enel and the Engie and the Semplas of the world, absolutely, but they are paying rent to someone. And normally, particularly wind projects in Mexico, because of the location of where wind is in Mexico, you're dealing with indigenous peoples, very vulnerable communities that had have nothing, and they started to get reasonable rents, millions of dollars thrown into these communities that had for decades and decades been forgotten by the government and by companies. And now the decision of the government is to stop this project, so people will again lose their rents, plus the shared benefits mechanisms, which is, an integral part of the energy reform, is not only to force companies to pay the rent, but actually to build shared benefits mechanisms that are culturally pertinent. So, the boom of certain indigenous designs, music, that happened in the last 5 years, for crying out loud, mezcal, that is not an accident. That is directly linked to the millions and millions of dollars that were thrown into this social action plans and built with communities to give them access to, not depend from the company of them receiving the rent, but rather that they are actually to exploit their culture and obtain resources by building, strengthening community projects, and using just low investment access to cheap credits from companies through these social action plans. And all of this is being taken away from them because of a political decision. I think that is quite the opposite to what environmental and energy justice is. I mean, it's just conflicting. And that happened. Actually, one of the lawsuits, one of the most painful lawsuits against the counter reform, was a lawsuit filed by an indigenous community of Juchitan, saying, hey, okay, it's okay, your political thing and the counter reform, but who's going to pay my rent? Where will my shared benefits go? And what will I do? And, it is what it is.
Thank you very much. We don't have a lot of time, but I would like to ask Daniel, in your book, you describe that distributed generation is also an option to reduce investment in the grid and transmission. Could you please explain a little bit of this topic and if there is a downside to distributed generation? And after that, we will go for the case of Mexico. Is this a solution that we can provide energy based on the limitations that we have with the regulation, with this new regulation in Mexico? But if we want to start, Daniel, if you can.
So distributed generation can get around some of the limitations we have when we can't build more transmission infrastructure. It has advantages of putting power generation within the hands of local communities, but just where the resources are as we move towards wanting to have more wind or solar, or I think geothermal could play a bigger role, the hydropower, you're not going to have the blend of resources that you need for 24/7 power when it's only local. So maybe there could be opportunities opened by storage, although storage is always going to be expensive and huge resource needs that are going to be competing as we electrify more vehicles. So it has a role, but I think we need to be realistic about what's also needed by taking advantage of geographic distribution and of doing things at scale.
Thank you very much. So Maria, for the case of Mexico.
In Mexico, there's a legal concept of distributed generation, which is that on-site generation, which capacity is below 500 kilowatts. If we're talking about that kind of projects, they don't require a permit granted by the Energy Regulatory Commission. They have accelerated interconnection procedures, and they can have access to net metering as a mechanism to get paid for any excess energy at a retail price. So it's a great world, regulatorily speaking. And of course, everything started back in 2010 when the CRE first issued the net metering regulations. But it was really since 2017 when we started to see an exponential growth of distributed generation installations in Mexico. after CRE issued the regulations based on the new competitive framework. And, this administration wants to help CFE and particularly in the generation field, but has not been necessarily aggressive against this kind of on-site distributed generation. At some point, there was concern that the president's initiative to amend the constitution would also hurt that segment. At the end, the amendment didn't pass at all, which is great news. But there was some kind of political clarification that there was no intention of harming that particular segment. Right now, we're talking about 2,000 megawatts of total capacity installed in that area, and around 250,000 interconnection contracts. So there's margin for a lot of growth, and this is useful not only for families in their residences, but for industries, even those that have loads above 1 megawatt or 5 megawatts or whatever. If they can install 499 kilowatts of distributed generation, that will help achieve their sustainability goals, at least in these years in which building something bigger is more difficult.
Thank you. Any final remarks, Chris, Hector, that you want to say? No? So do we have time for, sorry, Hector.
Yeah. Again, a quick story that I have about when we were talking about the actual construction of the facilities. As you know, in Mexico, Baja California, the peninsula, it's also an electric island. It's not integrated with the national grid. So the last administration, one of the final things that it tried to do, but it didn't go through in the end, and I'll tell you why it didn't go through, was to actually interconnect this island. And the only feasible technical solution was to run a T-line through the desert of Altar, which is literally the northern part of the Gulf of Cortés, the Sea of Cortés. So when I was retained to give a prefacability for this project, it's building a T-line in the desert. That sounds like plain vanilla and very obvious, like, yeah, boom, let's do it right now. It's easy peasy. No, it's owned by the government. So, oh yeah, boom, let's do it. And then I was retained and I got in touch with the Tohono O'odham Nation. And then I realized that they have this sacred rite, a pilgrimage that they do that's called La Ruta de la Sal, the Route of the Salt, where young members of the community, when they come of age, from a cultural perspective, they have to literally walk through the desert of Altar, which is, that's stuff. Like literally walking through the Sahara Desert, for crying out loud. I mean, that's stuff. And they have to survive, and it really blew me away that they actually do it. They walk through the desert, no water, no nothing, no fancy stuff. They just walk through it, and they do it because they have 5 sacred rites that are secret. And because of cultural intimacy, which is a human right, I cannot demand them, neither the government can demand them to disclose the actual sacred route because it's secret. So then how will I assess what is the impact if I cannot know where your sacred routes go? And that's hard. What I mean to say is there's this tiny things that need to be considered, and we need to have a 360 degrees view. And it's not only getting the power or electricity from one place to the other, it's about who will I be affecting in that process. And the example of the O'odham Nation is very, very clear. In the end, my assessment was this T-line cannot be built because we will somehow build a T-line in the middle of the desert, and in their worldview, the whole point is that you alone must survive in the altar desert and walk through it without water, and you will need to survive. So a T-line basically destroys that cosmogony. Their worldview just goes away, because you wouldn't be alone in the desert with nothing. There will be something, the T-line. So that is why it would be really hard to go through with that process. And my whole point is, yes, it's not only about building and generating the power, but actually getting it to the right place, to the right communities, but considering their worldview.
And also, we were discussing that that's the important part, but how you do it right. So very quickly, if you can tell us what is the way to do it, because
Yes.
sometimes you know that you cannot do
Yes.
it, but how you do it and how you do it right, no?
The right way to do it, and this is at least where we think that is right at this point, is FPIC, free, prior, and informed consultation. And this is in Equator Principles. This is directly linked to financing. This is an IFC. I mean, it's all over the place. It's very, very simple. Before deciding to invest in a project, fund a project, or develop a project, step number one is doing a social impact assessment, understanding the worldview of the company, of the communities that could be potentially affected by the project through a social impact assessment study, EVIS in Mexico, or human rights impact assessment. And the next step is FPIC, free, prior, and informed consultation. We must dialogue with this community and obtain their consent. That will naturally derive in probably adjustments to the design of the project. Yes, that will happen, but we will respect their human rights. And that finally closes the loop, because we will build shared benefits mechanisms where the project will fund activities that will create, in the end, stronger and more resilient communities that will not depend on the income of the project, but rather that they will strengthen their culture through low cost, high impact investments. So basically, the best recommendation, the best advice is, take a deep dive on who you're dealing with, dialogue with them, obtain their consent, and then build a strong social investment plan that is respectful of their worldview and of their human rights.
Thank you very much. You want to mention something?
Yeah, we have our own challenge with an isolated grid here in Texas, but not because we're a peninsula and not because of any indigenous community, but because we have a tribe of politicians who feel like it's their God-given right to manage their own electric grid without having any federal interference in it. And so sometimes these worldviews that I don't think have as enshrined in any UN treaty are costing economic opportunity, environmental opportunity, and costing lives. We had over 200 people die in the February 2021 freeze because of blackouts that wouldn't have happened if we weren't an isolated grid, that there's no reason we aren't connecting, bringing in power when we need it, and most of the time exporting clean power to other states or connecting more to Mexico would be other opportunities as well. We're going to be doing some research on those opportunities. So I think these sort of clashing of worldviews, of priorities, is that there are going to be winners and losers, but there are so many opportunities moving towards more abundant, more affordable, and cleaner energy than we've ever had before.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your time, your comments. It was really nice conversation. Thank you very much, everybody.